Anxiety is not merely a modern disease of the mind, nor is it a weakness of character. Anxiety is the inevitable cry of the psyche when something vital within us is being ignored. It is the trembling of the soul that says, "You have lost touch with your own depths." You see, man is not merely a creature of the external world. His true struggles are born from within, and anxiety, rather than being the enemy, is often the signal that life is calling us back toward wholeness. Those who suffer most are not always the weakest, but often those who hear most clearly the demands of the unconscious, though they do not yet know how to answer it. To master anxiety is not to silence it, but to learn what it wants from you. Anxiety often appears to us as an enemy, an intruder that unsettles our peace and disturbs our daily lives. But in truth, it is more akin to a messenger that emerges from the depths of the unconscious. The human mind is not a simple mechanism that can be neatly controlled or silenced. It is a vast, layered field of both conscious and unconscious contents. And when the conscious ego refuses to acknowledge the deeper currents of the psyche, those currents force their way into awareness. Anxiety is often the first expression of this force. It is the psyche's way of signaling that something vital has been neglected, that something repressed is seeking recognition. When you feel anxiety, you are not simply experiencing a malfunction of the nervous system. You are witnessing the language of your own unconscious. The mistake most people make is to treat anxiety as if it were purely external, as if it must be conquered or eradicated like an invader. But by trying to destroy it, one inadvertently ignores the very truth it carries. Imagine a messenger who comes to deliver a warning, and instead of listening, you chase him away. The message does not disappear, it lingers, unheeded, and the consequences of ignoring it eventually grow more severe. This is precisely what happens when people attempt to suppress their anxiety through distraction, denial, or self-medication. The anxiety does not vanish. It becomes stronger, more insistent, and more destructive, because the unconscious will not be silenced until it is heard. What then is the message? It varies from person to person, but often anxiety points to a division between the life we are living and the life we are meant to live. The unconscious does not create anxiety for its own amusement. It does so to alert us that we have betrayed something essential within ourselves. Perhaps we have been living according to the expectations of others, suffocating under social masks, denying desires, dreams, or truths that threaten our fragile self-image. The deeper mind will not tolerate such neglect forever. Anxiety is the signal flare that rises when the true self is imprisoned by the ego's narrow view of life. Seen in this light, anxiety is not a flaw but a teacher. It urges us to stop, to listen, to question, and to reorient ourselves. The one who suffers anxiety is, paradoxically, often closer to psychological growth than the one who never feels it, for the anxious soul is already in dialogue, however painful, with the unconscious. To master anxiety is therefore not to eliminate it, but to enter into relationship with it. One must ask, what truth is being concealed behind this trembling? What part of me demands expression? What life is waiting to be lived that I have not dared to embrace? Anxiety, when approached with courage and openness, becomes less of a curse and more of a guide. It shows us that our soul is alive, restless, unwilling to accept stagnation, and if we dare to face it not with hostility, but with curiosity, we begin to discover that within the very disorder of anxiety lies the path to wholeness. Anxiety is not merely a mental or emotional disturbance. It is a symptom of inner conflict. Deep within every human being lies a tension between the persona, the mask we show to the world, and the shadow, the hidden, repressed aspects of ourselves that we prefer to deny. This conflict produces a constant friction, and when the gap between the two grows too wide, anxiety emerges as the signal of imbalance. It is as though the unconscious mind rebels against the artificial image we try to maintain, reminding us that we cannot sustain a life built entirely on pretense. The more one clings to an inauthentic identity, the more the shadow presses forward, and the body and psyche register this struggle as unease, nervousness, and dread. If you look closely, you will see that anxiety is not random. It often appears in moments where the ego's carefully constructed defenses are threatened, when something touches upon a truth we fear to confront. A person who strives endlessly to appear strong may be haunted by an undercurrent of anxiety that whispers of their hidden vulnerability. Another who plays the role of the compliant and agreeable may find themselves plagued with panic when their suppressed anger rises toward the surface. In this way, anxiety reveals the hidden war being waged between the self we want others to see and the self that actually exists. It is important to understand that this conflict cannot be resolved by annihilating the shadow. One cannot simply discard or destroy these unwanted aspects. They are a part of the totality of the psyche. To repress them is to create more anxiety, more tension, and more destructive eruptions. The path forward lies in integration, in acknowledging that the shadow, though dark and troubling, contains essential truths and energies we need. When we repress aggression, it festers, but when acknowledged, it can become assertiveness and strength. When we repress fear, it paralyzes us, but when confronted, it teaches caution and wisdom. Anxiety is the psychic alarm that forces us to recognize that the shadow has been ignored for too long. Thus, to master anxiety, one must turn inward, not outward. Instead of running from the discomfort, one must dare to ask, what is this feeling trying to reveal about me? What part of myself have I denied? The person who listens deeply to their anxiety begins to see the outlines of their shadow, and in that recognition lies the possibility of transformation. The inner conflict loses its destructive power when the ego stops fighting and instead opens itself to dialogue with the unconscious. Anxiety, then, is not only a torment but also a bridge, the painful but necessary link that forces the conscious mind to reunite with the disowned parts of the self. Through this confrontation, one finds not only relief from anxiety, but also a deeper, more authentic sense of being. Anxiety becomes destructive when it is misunderstood as an enemy to be eliminated rather than a message to be interpreted. In our modern world, people are taught to suppress or escape discomfort at all costs, through distractions, addictions, or the pursuit of constant stimulation. Yet what is repressed does not vanish. It grows stronger in the depths of the unconscious and returns in distorted, tormenting forms. This is why anxiety, when ignored, begins to dominate the individual, tightening its grip until it seems unbearable. But the truth is that anxiety, though painful, is a guide. It is the psyche's way of signaling that something essential has been neglected or concealed, that the individual is living in contradiction to their deeper truth. Carl Jung emphasized that neurosis arises not from the presence of conflict, but from the refusal to face it. Anxiety is not the problem itself. It is the signpost pointing toward the problem. A person who feels anxious before speaking in public may not simply be afraid of the audience, but might be confronting a deeper fear of exposure, of being seen as they truly are rather than the persona they have carefully constructed. Another who feels constant anxiety in their relationships may not be afraid of abandonment alone, but of the shadow aspects of dependency and vulnerability they have denied in themselves. If one silences the anxiety with distractions or quick solutions, they miss the message entirely, and the unconscious must shout louder, producing even greater inner turmoil. To see anxiety in this way requires a shift of perspective, from avoidance to inquiry. Instead of asking, "How can I get rid of this feeling?" the question must become, "What is this feeling trying to teach me?" The paradox is that the very act of listening to anxiety begins to dissolve its destructive grip. When it is approached with awareness, its overwhelming force diminishes because its purpose is fulfilled, It has led the conscious mind to what was hidden. This process is not comfortable. It demands honesty, patience, and courage, for it requires us to encounter aspects of ourselves we would rather deny. Yet through this confrontation, anxiety loses its status as a mysterious tormentor and becomes a tool of self-revelation. It forces us to slow down, to examine the cracks in the mask we wear, to acknowledge the unspoken truths we carry. By interpreting anxiety rather than rejecting it, we align ourselves more closely with the whole of our being, and in this alignment, a new form of strength emerges, the ability to stand firmly in the face of life's uncertainties without being consumed by fear. Much of anxiety arises from the tension between the life we are living outwardly and the life that stirs within us, unexpressed. Carl Jung understood this as the split between the persona, the mask we present to society, and the deeper self that longs for authenticity. The persona is necessary. It allows us to function in the world, to play roles that help us belong and communicate. Yet when this mask becomes too rigid, when it silences the voice of the soul, the psyche begins to rebel. This rebellion often takes the form of anxiety, that restless agitation which whispers, "Something is wrong. You are not where you are meant to be." Many people mistake this inner tension for a flaw in themselves, believing that if only they were more disciplined, more confident, more like others, their anxiety would vanish. But what if the anxiety is not pointing to weakness at all, but to the falseness of the life they are living? Consider the individual who follows a career chosen not by passion, but by expectation, perhaps to please family, to achieve status, or to conform to the demands of society. Outwardly, their life appears successful, yet inwardly they are suffocated. Every day feels like a betrayal of something unnamed within, and the psyche, unable to bear this silence, erupts in anxious unrest. Jung taught that the psyche strives for wholeness, and anything that obstructs this striving will produce suffering. Anxiety, in this sense, is the tension of the soul pressing against the walls of the false identity. It is not random nor meaningless. It is a signal that life is out of alignment with inner truth. The more one resists this signal, the louder it becomes. The more one forces themselves to remain in a life not truly their own, the more unbearable the anxiety grows, until it may culminate in depression, breakdown, or a sense of emptiness that no external achievement can fill. To master anxiety, one must examine where this split occurs. Where in life are you playing a role that is not truly yours? What truths about yourself have you buried in order to be accepted? The path forward is not about tearing off the mask entirely, for some roles must be played, but about softening it, allowing the deeper self to breathe through it. This requires the courage to listen to your inner dissatisfaction and to honor it, not as weakness but as guidance. In doing so, anxiety ceases to be a constant torment and becomes instead a compass, pointing toward the reconciliation of the self with its own neglected depths. When the persona and the inner self begin to align, the soul rests easier, and the anxious whisper that once disturbed every moment fades into clarity, strength, and a quiet sense of being true to oneself. Anxiety often emerges from the battle between control and surrender. Human beings are terrified of uncertainty, and in their fear, they construct elaborate illusions of control. They plan, they predict, they calculate, believing that if they can master every detail of the future, the chaos of existence will spare them. But life does not bend to such rigidity. The unexpected always intrudes, the illness, the betrayal, the failure, the sudden shift of fate, and in that moment the fragile scaffolding of control collapses, leaving the individual in panic. Carl Jung observed that the psyche suffers when it resists the flow of life, when it clings too tightly to what cannot be guaranteed. Anxiety, in many cases, is the gnawing recognition that life will not conform to our demands. This is why anxious minds are often filled with endless what-ifs. What if I lose my job? What if my relationship ends? What if disaster strikes tomorrow? The mind, seeking safety, races ahead of the present, attempting to resolve problems that may never exist. Yet the more it grasps, the more unstable it becomes, because reality refuses to be boxed in by fantasy. In truth, the attempt to escape uncertainty only multiplies it. Each question leads to another, each fear feeds a new one, until the mind becomes a cage spinning endlessly around its own bars. Jung understood that the key was not to eliminate uncertainty, but to transform one's relationship to it. Anxiety becomes destructive when we view uncertainty as an enemy, but when we begin to see uncertainty as life's natural rhythm, something shifts. The unknown is not only a threat, but also a source of growth, surprise, and transformation. Every great change, every meaningful encounter, every step into authenticity requires the willingness to step into the unknown. To refuse it is to suffocate in stagnation, to cling to safety until life itself passes by unnoticed. The mastery of anxiety lies, then, not in greater control, but in deeper trust. Trust not in outcomes, which are never certain, but in one's own ability to endure, adapt, and grow. When a person realizes that they do not need to control every storm, only to strengthen their ship, anxiety loosens its grip. The energy once spent on fear can then be channeled into presence, into creative action, into embracing the flow of what is. The paradox is that surrender does not weaken us, it frees us. By releasing the futile demand to control life's unfolding, we recover the strength to live fully within it. Anxiety transforms from a paralyzing force into a subtle teacher, reminding us that the unknown, though frightening, is also the birthplace of everything new. Would you like me to now expand key point 6 in the same way? Anxiety often thrives in silence, not because it is truly unspeakable, but because we refuse to give it language. Jung believed that what remains unexpressed in the unconscious grows in power, and so it is with the fears we bury. When anxiety is hidden, it festers like a wound concealed under cloth, never healing because it is never exposed to the air. People tell themselves that if they keep quiet, if they endure quietly, if they never speak of their restlessness, it will eventually vanish. But repression does not dissolve tension, it multiplies it. The psyche begins to whisper in intrusive thoughts, in sleepless nights, in sudden bursts of dread, forcing the individual to face what they sought to avoid. To speak one's anxiety is not weakness but the first act of courage. In naming it, in giving it form through words, we strip it of its absolute power. The unconscious becomes conscious, and the shadows that once loomed as monsters are revealed as fears that can be understood and managed. This is why Jung emphasized the healing force of dialogue, not merely with others, but with oneself. Journaling, therapy, conversation, or even silent reflection can act as channels through which the vague weight of anxiety becomes a discernible pattern. Once visible, it can be questioned, restructured, and slowly integrated into the whole of one's being. Yet many resist this process, believing that to admit anxiety is to admit defeat. They cling to the illusion of strength, wearing a mask of composure while trembling within. But true strength is not the absence of fear. It is the willingness to confront it openly. To speak your anxiety is to disarm it. It is to take back authority over your own narrative rather than letting unconscious dread write the story of your life in secret. Jung understood that the act of confession, of bringing hidden content to light, was not simply a release of pressure, but a profound reordering of the psyche. The voice that speaks anxiety also reclaims dignity. It declares, "This is my struggle, and I will not be ruled by silence." When shared with others, it creates connection, for nothing is more isolating than the belief that one suffers alone. In discovering that others too carry their invisible burdens, the anxious individual sees that their struggle is part of the human condition, not a solitary defect. This recognition does not eliminate anxiety, but it removes the shame that amplifies it, turning suffering into a bridge rather than a prison. In this way, speaking is not merely therapeutic, it is liberating. What is confessed loses its chains. The words we dare to form become the doorway through which healing begins. Anxiety cannot be fully silenced, but once given voice, it ceases to be an enemy lurking in the shadows and becomes instead a companion guiding us toward deeper self-knowledge. The final mastery over anxiety does not come from eradicating it, for such a goal is both impossible and misguided. Anxiety, like every other psychic force, has its role in shaping the human soul. Jung taught that wholeness is not the elimination of opposites, but their integration. To conquer anxiety is not to destroy it, but to transform its raw energy into a higher form of consciousness. When you resist it, when you fight to suppress it, it grows stronger, for the unconscious does not yield to denial. But when you learn to hold it, to sit with its tension, to endure its weight without fleeing, you begin to transmute fear into power. The very sensation that once paralyzed you becomes fuel for self-realization. Consider that anxiety is often a signal, not an enemy. It points to the unresolved conflict within, to the unlived life that presses for expression. Many people live small, constrained existences, shackled not by external forces, but by their own refusal to confront discomfort. Anxiety whispers of paths not taken, of truths not faced, of shadows not integrated. To listen to it is to receive a summons from the deeper self. It tells you where you must grow, where you must stretch beyond what is familiar. Without it, you would remain stagnant, lulled into the false comfort of mediocrity. Thus, mastery is found not in silencing the voice, but in interpreting its message. This mastery is not achieved overnight. It requires discipline, patience, and above all, courage. One must learn to breathe into the storm, to endure the trembling of the body and the chaos of the mind without surrendering to panic. It is in these moments of stillness, amidst the tempest, that a transformation occurs. You discover that anxiety cannot kill you, that its intensity is only the echo of a deeper call. By withstanding it, you forge resilience. By embracing it, you cultivate wisdom. Each encounter becomes less about survival and more about revelation. Ultimately, to master anxiety is to see it as a teacher. It strips away illusions of control and forces you to confront the fragility of existence. But in doing so, it also opens the possibility of a more authentic life. No longer driven by the compulsions of avoidance, you stand rooted in your own strength. You begin to act not out of fear, but out of clarity, and this is the true essence of mastery. Not that you are free from anxiety forever, but that you are no longer enslaved by it. It becomes part of you, like the shadow, like grief, like desire, integrated into the totality of your being, no longer an intruder, but an ally.